How did Michael Schumacher go from becoming Formula One's most successful driver ever with Ferrari to looking completely mediocre when he returned with Mercedes? The expectations for Schumacher's comeback with Mercedes in 2010 were clear. There was no doubt that securing title number 8 was the aim. But Schumacher's 3 years at Mercedes fell painfully short of expectations, yielding 0 wins, just 1 podium, a thumping intra-team defeat by Nico Rosberg, and a best championship finish of 8th. It was a painful fall from grace for a driver who was F1's clear benchmark for well over a decade and redefined what was required of successful F1 drivers. So where did it all go so wrong? To understand why Schumacher wasn't the same driver when he returned, we need to rewind to 10 months before Schumacher's comeback announcement. As well as periodically testing Ferrari's F1 cars, Schumacher tried his hand at motorcycle racing during his 3-year F1 racing hiatus. In February 2009, that attempt at becoming a motorcycle racer ended with him falling heavily on his head at the Cartagena track in Spain. After falling from the bike at around 130 miles per hour and being thrown into the air, he landed headfirst in a gravel trap and lay unconscious for several minutes. It was reported at the time that a hospital checkup had revealed no injuries. This was false, however, as his personal physician, the late Johannes Pyle, revealed a few months later at a press conference in Switzerland. In that press conference, Dr. Pyle explained why Schumacher had been forced to turn down the opportunity of deputising at Ferrari for the injured Felipe Massa during the latter half of F1's 2009 season. That comeback had been thwarted because of the pain Schumacher was suffering in his neck after testing the Ferrari at Mugello. That was part of the after effects of the motorcycle accident and came from a tear in the left-hand side ligament or tendon linking the base of the skull to the neck. This was 7 months after the accident. Although that particular injury would in time heal and allow Schumacher to make his 2010 comeback, the full extent of the other injuries revealed by the doctor made it clear the tendon tear was just a minor part of the story. It was suspected the only reason Schumacher didn't suffer graver consequences from his injuries, as is the case for most normal people, was due to the strength of Schumacher's neck from his long career in car racing. Dr. Pyle had shared a concern with Schumacher that any heavy accident in the 2009 Ferrari risked further damaging the critical part of the skull before it had built up full strength, which risked long-term injury or even paralysis. What about the neurological damage then? Could that explain Schumacher's post-comeback decline? In Pyle's words, the left artery broke, and there are only 2 arteries which supply blood to the cerebellum in the brain. While the artery was repaired, such injuries invariably bring after effects. The neurological damage caused usually leads to reduced capability in certain high-level functions. If this is indeed the case for Schumacher, it's not so difficult to imagine why post-bike injury Schumacher may have not been quite the driver he had been. It's a question of losing some of the sensitivity to rotation and yaw behind the wheel, not a decline in reaction times. After all, even at his peak, Schumacher's reactions were notoriously average, as was repeatedly affirmed in tests at Ferrari. They were about the same as mine, revealed as then technical director Ross Brawn. It was with those reactions that he rewrote the record books of F1 success and established himself as one of the greatest of all time. So it's really far-fetched to believe that any difference in reaction times from 37-year-old Schumacher in 2006 to 41-year-old Schumacher in 2010 were responsible for the reduction in his performance. But the impact of the injury feels in hindsight more significant than it did at the time. During his title steamrolling Ferrari years, Schumacher was a master of pivoting the car on the edge right at the beginning of the corner and then making no further inputs. But there was little sign of that driving approach throughout his 3 years at Mercedes. In hindsight, it was rather like listening to Max Verstappen explain why he couldn't get the early season Red Bulls of 2022 and 23 to go significantly faster than Sergio Perez. In both cases, by imposing a restriction on their preferred way of driving, the cars were placing a false ceiling on their performance. Partly that was down to the traits of the Mercedes cars Schumacher was given to drive. The team had fallen behind on development during its near collapse in the fairy tale 2009 season under the Brawn GP name. Mercedes' car designs were flawed, but it was also about the control spec Bridgestone and Pirelli tyres. In Schumacher's time there during the tyre war, Ferrari had been the only major team contracted to Bridgestone, with rivals Michelin providing the rubber for Ferrari's main competition. Bridgestone, Ferrari and Schumacher were at the time closely entwined. Schumacher was developing not just the car but the tyres, which enabled him to drive in his preferred way. He was in essence enjoying tailor-made tyres developed just for him. This isn't to suggest that he wouldn't have been super successful in a controlled tyre era. He had, after all, won championships in the past without this edge at Benetton. But it definitely added to his advantage, and it had been taken away by the controlled tyre era when he returned. Jock Clear, his senior performance engineer at the time, believed the driving style required by the Pirellis better suited drivers like Rosberg, Fernando Alonso, and even Sergio Perez, who was thriving for Sauber in 2012. A big part of Schumacher's advantage during his great years had been his amazing ability to lap flat out for an entire stint. Former Ferrari teammate Eddie Irvine marvelled at how Schumacher could do 76 laps looking like an accident about to happen. That was, in Irvine's words, insane. But it became a completely redundant skill in the Pirelli era from 2011. The tyres could no longer withstand being raced flat out. Instead, drivers were driving 2 to 3 seconds off the pace just to get the stint length required for the optimum strategy. The returning Michael raged against it. He said after the 2012 Bahrain Grand Prix, "The main thing I feel unhappy about is everyone has to drive well below a driver's, and in particular the car's limits, to maintain the tyres." He compared it to driving on raw eggs and questioned why tyres had become such a defining feature of F1. Just as with the way the control Pirellis and their dislike of combined braking and cornering put a limit on Schumacher's ability to find lap time in qualifying, these endurance traits were restricting him on race day. Quite in what proportion all these factors combined to make Schumacher's comeback less great than it might have been can't be known, but we can be pretty sure he didn't go from one of the greatest of all time to an also-ran just because of the passage of 36 months. It's easy to look at Schumacher's 3 years at Mercedes and conclude things ended on a low in 2012, with his lowest ever championship placing in F1 in 13th and a meagre points tally of 49, a long way off Rosberg's tally of 93. But Schumacher's 2012 season was actually the most competitive of his comeback. He was 10-10 with Rosberg in qualifying and lost points when the Mercedes was at its most competitive early in the season. He only scored 2 points in the first 7 races, but had the pace for far more, if it hadn't been for a litany of bad luck and one costly error in particular. That major error cost him dearly in Monaco. There, Schumacher topped an F1 qualifying session for the first time in 6 years, but couldn't start from pole position because he'd rear-ended Bruno Senna in Barcelona and earned a 5-place grid penalty. Even more than the sole podium of his comeback at Valencia, Schumacher's Monaco pole was the biggest reminder that he could still deliver magic at 43. He hadn't been particularly quick at any other point of the weekend, but delivered a special lap in Q3, driving one-handed around the Grand Hotel hairpin and likewise into the swimming pool chicane to adjust his brake balance. On Sunday he retired with 15 laps to go because of a fuel pressure problem. So there's an alternative reality where Schumacher doesn't have a grid penalty, starts from pole, but retires while leading. Even more brutal. Then Mercedes strategist James Vowles said he was truly heartbroken for Schumacher because he deserved a victory for all of the effort he poured into Mercedes. Then Chief Mercedes race engineer Andrew Chauvelin said Schumacher gave Mercedes a wake-up call when he joined. Chauvelin credited Schumacher with raising the level of the team that would go on to win 8 of the next championships once he left. Mercedes was 4th or 5th best during Schumacher's time, but was second in its first year without him in 2013 and went on to dominate the turbo hybrid era from 2014. Sporting director Ron Meadows even said his biggest F1 regret is not winning with Schumacher because he was a different level of driver than the team had ever worked with before. Vowles does believe signs of age-related decline were starting to show during Schumacher's time at Mercedes. Shunting into Senna in Barcelona and woeful back-to-back collisions in Singapore in 2011 and 2012 were all uncharacteristic misjudgments. But Vowles reckons had Schumacher stayed for 2013 instead of retiring again and been replaced by Lewis Hamilton, he'd have had a fantastic year. It's then not a major leap to ponder, what if Schumacher stayed for 2014 when Mercedes dominated F1? Could he have fought for an 8th world title? After all, Schumacher said the contract discussions at the time were for another multi-year deal rather than a single-year extension. In the end, Schumacher didn't stay because his performances weren't strong enough in his 3 years against Rosberg and because he divvied on his future while Hamilton was ready to commit to replacing him. In the words of Vowles, Schumacher knew that the end of 2012 was his time to step away for good. His F1 comeback was ultimately a failure versus the sky-high expectations from driver and team. The timing, the injury, the controlled tyres, the change in the demands of the drivers, and some signs of age-related decline all stopped Schumacher from delivering the wins and championships he targeted in late 2009. But Schumacher can take plenty of credit for the success Mercedes still enjoys today, with many of the same people, who will all tell you Schumacher helped transform Mercedes into a championship-winning behemoth, even if painfully it never won with him.